Were Seadoo being coy, a little bit naughty, and double bluffing us, and are we going to still get that 1630 or turbo spark, basically a faster spark, anytime soon? Well, I wanted to make a follow-up video covering 3 key things. Number 1, strong reasoning to believe that they are going to do a faster spark. Number 2, the product styling, having now had some days pass, and being a little bit objective, having compared the past models that have gone by, and maybe why I was being a bit harsh on Seadoo. And the third thing, some cool additional details about the Spark, which I maybe missed on the first video, which I want to get into. So let's get into the video. So in the following days after the Seadoo launch, I've been watching really closely the way that Seadoo have responded to a lot of the press within the comments, and what further details they put out around the Spark. And I must say, it does seem promising. So when I put to Seadoo in the comments, when are we going to see a performance increase on the top end, they actually replied saying it's an evolution and perfection takes time. Now, if you unpack that to me would suggest a lot of time and energy has gone into the R&D of this top deck redesign. And I think, as I said in my first video, they ran out of time. And I do honestly think, I'm an optimist, you'll know that by my channel, and that's why I buy 30-year-old skis. I think in the coming years, like we saw with the 717 in the XP in 95, we will see more horsepower. I've seen a lot of comments at this point, exactly like my sentiment, which is, where is the 1630? Show us it now. And when the 1630 gets thrown in the comments, it's not an immediate shutdown. I think Seadoo are actually coming around to the idea that there is that segment of riders that want the smallest craft, the most playful craft, but with a little bit more performance. So I feel like the Seadoo Spark Trixx, the new version, the new gen, as they've actually coined it, it's kind of obvious really if you think about it, is an evolution. So that to me means that we probably will get more horsepower. If you look at the new Seadoo Spark, they've made a ton of improvements, right, to the top deck. Now, if you think about any life cycle of any craft, let's take the RXP because that's had a 25 horsepower increase, which annoys the hell out of me because the 300 was already a beast anyway. How much faster, guys, do you want to go on these performance crafts? Whereas the poor old Spark at the lower end has been crying out, please give me more horses. Didn't get anything. So it shows that they can extract more horses from that same similar engine, albeit they've re-engineered the hell out of it. I've had a deeper dive since my first video where I said they were pushing that engine to the extremity. That was a little bit disingenuous because they have done a ton of engineering to that 1360, I've said it so many times, I'm getting it wrong, that 1630 engine. So if we look at the 900 Ace, which has been in the Spark since day one, if you were to take the 900 Ace engine, there probably is the prospective ability for them to re-engineer it. Now, whether they need to add a turbo alongside making modifications to that 900 Ace, if you look at the sort of the aftermarket landscape of the fact that we're seeing things like turbo kits successfully fitting into those Gen 1 holes with not very much modification, the remaps and tunes that we're seeing, of which I'll come on to in a sec, what the new Trixx Mode will likely be, it seems to me logical that they're going to do it. What I'm basically saying is it's not out of the scope of possibility that in the next couple of years we might then see Seadoo saying, and now here's the icing on top of the cake, if you like, with the bigger bit of horsepower that we've all been asking for. But I actually think they might even go one step further and bring back the XP model name as like a complete, you know, evolution as they've touched on, and go full circle. I mean, like RXP is a title that started in 2004 and they've kept it to this day. So why can't we bring back the beloved XP? I don't think they're ever going to bring back the GSX, and people have been saying to me, Joe, they might bring back GSX. They're not going to bring back GSX. GSX for me is too muddy in terms of like the GTIs, GTXs of the world. The GSX for me was always not as powerful from like a brand name as the XP. Going off on a tangent. So if we look at that current new hull, in terms of the top deck redesign, they've made the seat wider. If it's got wider specifically in the actual plastic Polytech which sits below the seat, there's going to be enough room in there to at the very least get additional componentry, i.e. additional cooling, potentially a turbo, completely re-engineering that block as they've done with the 1630. If they want to go completely all out and really give us what they want, we might still see that 1630. For me, I think that that's like folklore rumours that sort of circulated on the internet. and undoubtedly they probably prototyped and tested it, but I just don't think they're going to do it. One of my followers on Classic Jetskis actually said if you put a 1630 Joe into the Spark, it's just going to come top heavy, it's going to tip loads, and I was kind of like, yeah, that sounds exciting. But I get his point. If you take a huge engine or a bigger engine and put it into a smaller hull, there are always going to be tangible drawbacks to that optimized size engine. I've seen the top deck off on a Seadoo Spark, and I must admit, everything seems positioned nicely, everything's got its space, and it seems like a proportional engine to that hull. Now, if you look at the turbo kits on the aftermarket landscape at the moment, so the kits that you can buy and fit to your current Gen 1 Spark, they don't actually require a ton of modification to actually fit them in. I think there's a little bit of trimming to some of the polystyrene things, but you are seeing Spark turbos do 65 miles an hour with that same 900 ace. Now, yes, undoubtedly, I know what you're all going to say in the comments, that's going to put more stress and strain, and this is definitely what Seadoo will be saying, on that 900 ace, which would thus reduce the longevity of that engine and not probably be something they want to do. Ultimately, they want that 2-year warranty period on any new skis they're selling to be near a sure thing, then they're not going to have tons of people in the workshop with issues with that ski. So, that big point of contention, the product styling, well, I've got to be honest, it's now been, what, 4 days, and every time I keep looking at the Spark, I start to like it more. And I'm not just saying it because everyone says that I love Seadoo and that I'm a Seadoo fanboy and everything else. I kind of think it's exactly as I anticipated in the first video. Anytime you see a design for the first time, you always compare it to what you've seen to start with. I'll use the Range Rover analogy again, the angular design of the Gen 1 Evoque, and then that follow-up Gen 2, which is much more refined. I look at this Spark now, there's a lot more footage that's came out of like the Spark statically on like beaches and more scenic sort of setups, and I look at it and I think, it does look more refined. Those flowing lines in particular, the main point that I actually love the look of, having seen more angles of it, is the way that the actual center console flows into those ergolock sections. Now again, they're not calling it ergolock, but it to me looks like a more padded section. I really want to know what the material is, whether it's still plastic. Obviously on the original Gen Spark, you had those sort of plastic shrouds that you could remove to get access to the steering column and stuff. But the way that that all flows through and then down into the actual front storage bin, I think that I missed in the initial sense. I was calling it bubblified, but I think what Seadoo have tried to do is take out a lot of the intersecting lines, which basically visually break up the design. Now, I'm not reverting on what I've said, that the Gen 1 has that fighter pilot style, really aggressive look, which makes it look like a bullet in the water. That all remains true, and undoubtedly the Gen 1 Spark aesthetically will still go down in history as like an amazing feat of product styling, kicking on from what came before. But I think this is like they're calling it an evolution, right? Which to me feels like they're going to incrementally improve upon it. Not the product styling, but the actual features and hopefully the performance. So I guess what I'm saying here, with a number of days now past, I look at the Spark, the new Spark, and think, actually I can see what the designers are doing. It's almost like when you're 18, 19 years of age and you make more immature, brash decisions, and they're still good decisions at that time, and a couple of years go by and then actually you think, I'll do those slightly different. And I think the Seadoo have looked at the details. Like for example, I've looked quite a lot at the quite nerdy details, but if you look at like the front bumper, for example, that now feels almost integrated to the actual whole complete assembly, whereas before on the previous Spark, it actually felt like a Meccano, you clip it on bumper. Now again, I love that product styling, but from like a product design point of view, you can't ignore the fact that they've done a great job of just creating all the flowing lines. They actually use the terminology flowing lines. I still think in places it looks too pumped up, like it looks too inflated, which does cheapen the look, which is why some people are calling it the Fisher-Price toy. If you think of any blow molded product, like a kid's toy set or like a table set, they always have that more bubblified look because it's softer and it's more friendly and there's less jagged edges. I think Seadoo are suffering from a little bit of that, and I think what's also definitely not helping is the fact that the seater is wider and fatter, so it just looks like it's gained a few pounds, and although that'll undoubtedly be more comfy, it's lost that like stealth, aggressive look. Now, for me, I'm coming around to the fact that the seat's wider because as I've delved into more of what I think rationale of why they've done that, the actual plastic that sits below is also wider, as I've touched on. So that means that we hopefully can get a bigger engine or more componentry below. So if the seat has to get wider for that rationale, There's no problem with that in my book. Whether the stitching details I touched on my first video is a good thing, I kind of like that complete inclusion. It reminded me of the old Gen 2 strokes, where you just have one piece of consistent vinyl, less things to rip, less stitching to deal with. But again, they're trying to introduce a little bit of that luxury touch to it, I believe. So I'm still not a fan of the screen. I still don't revert on that. I still feel like they've lost the actual finesse level of having all of the dials and stuff follow the profile of the shroud. Maybe they could refine that in the next year. I don't think a surround of a screen is a deal breaker to revise. So those sort of details makes me feel more reassured that they're not wholesale changes. Like for example, if you were to say, oh, I really don't like the way that the front storage bin assembly looks, they're not going to change that, guys, because that is the whole structural infrastructure of the front of the ski. Things like shrouds that sit around the actual screen, they're the sort of subtle details that could revise in future years. As for the FreeUp platform, which I think is the weakest out of the lineup, they do need to add that Seadoo logo back in for me, but again, from a molding point of view, that's not something that is like, no, it's never gonna happen. I think that's the sort of thing they would listen to their actual customers' feedback and think, actually, yeah, their bit of brand presence has been lost with having that logo there. One thing Seadoo have always done and not been shy on is putting the Seadoo logo on things. Again, going back into that premium look and feel, you tend to see a lot of the decals being stripped away on the designs, I guess because they think it makes things look cleaner, but the RXP is definitely suffering from a lack of decals, for a better word, and the Seadoo Spark as well. I always felt on the original Gen Spark, regardless if I liked the product styling, it lacked decals. It had that one sort of Seadoo diagonal logo, and it had the other sort of subtle decals. For me, when you look at the sort of the modded Sparks, which have got the decals on there reminiscent back to the old XPs, I always look at that Spark and think, wow, it's complete now. Why didn't Seadoo do that? And I think it's just because Seadoo are trying to make the lower end crafts feel like the high end crafts. But what you have to think is when someone buys like a GTX Limited or maybe even an RXT X, they're actually buying into a more premium end product. Whereas if you're looking at a Seadoo Spark, there's no getting away from the fact that people want Sparks for the playful fun factor, of course. The Seadoo Spark is the entry level ski, so I think that it naturally can be a little bit cheaper. So the final bit I wanted to touch on is the actual additional little details that I've noticed having watched more information on the Spark. The biggest thing for me, which I completely missed, and I don't think they actually spoke about in the original launch video, is if you take the seat off, you have an access panel. Now for me, only ever being able to get to the engine from the access panel on the side for things like when you're washing down after you've been in the salt and stuff. I hated their original instruction video where it was like, open the access port, squirt a hose pipe in there, but you can't get to any of it. Things like to put like an anti-corrosive lube on there, things like that, it's all really, really hard to do. Having just that little additional access point means that you then obviously still have the side access, you have obviously the dipstick side, and you obviously have the top. That will give you a little bit more ability to get the hose in there, actually add the anti-corrosive spray in a little bit more diligently. That's all good things, and it also to me still feels like they're doing that because when they go for a bigger engine that obviously has more maintenance demands, that is the reality of it, you have an ability to get to things. But if you think about any performance-based craft, you always have more access because inevitably maintenance is going to be slightly higher. Seadoo always spoke about the fact that the Spark was like 90, something obscene, I never believed it, but it was like 99% watertight. But they've obviously recognized through that user feedback that when you go into the seas, particularly, salt just gets in, and if you can't clean it out, then those engines tend to corrode and it gets nasty and all that sort of stuff, condensation. So it's good to see. It also looks as if that side hatch has got slightly bigger, which is also good to see. And the big bit everyone's talking about, which again, I don't think they did a very good job in that initial launch video of really heroing what it was going to be, was this Trixx mode. Now, if you think of conventionally on a Spark, you'd obviously hold down the button to go into the sport mode. There's now obviously that additional Trixx mode, which as it says in the title, will most likely be for those lower end maneuvering of tricks, jumping out of the water, doing the wheelies, helping with that transition with new IBR. But I'm hoping that what I would say will be a remap, in all honesty. If you think about what people have already done to their tricks, where they remap them to like 110, it always affects the low end torque and their sort of ability to pop up the wheel easier, to pop it out of the water, and that initial acceleration. It seems logical to me that Seadoo are going to have that remap or the tune done to be able to achieve what they're calling the Trixx mode. Whether that map only becomes relevant when you go into the Trixx mode, I don't know. But someone actually commented on my first video saying people that have actually tested the new Trixx, they're getting 55 miles an hour out of it. I still don't see how that's possible, but plausibly, if it's a new mode and the remap takes it to 110, which I know they're saying they've not done, so it's not as if on the spec sheet it's going to say it's got 110 horsepower. But if the remap is getting more performance out of that 900 Ace, coupled with the new IBR, and potentially a new intake gate and impeller, which no one spoke about yet. So put in the comments if any of you guys know that are still there in Atlanta. Maybe there will be 55 miles an hour out of it. In my opinion, I've never seen any more than 52 miles an hour out of a stock Spark. So I still don't quite understand how the same engine with no horsepower upgrade is going to get you to 55 miles an hour, but maybe there is something there in that IBR which I'm totally missing, the way that it sort of cuts through the water. The hull's the same, obviously. So there are some details around this new IBR Trixx Mode, which I think makes it slightly more compelling, that if you've become completely familiar with the Gen 1 Spark, you might jump onto a Gen 2 Spark and it'd be like, okay, there is a new bag of tricks, as they've said. I never liked the way they market that in the first promo video. It felt like a bit of a gimmick to me. But I guess what they're saying is the ability to do new tricks might be improved through this new IBR system. Now, I will still stand by the fact that doing wheelies on the current Spark is dead easy. There is a little bit of a lag there, isn't there, when you go from reverse to accelerating forward. But that being said, I've always found it super, super easy when I've jumped on them to actually do the wheelies and pop them out of the water. So they're making it more compliant again, which I always hate in skis. Making things easier is not always a good thing. It makes it more mass market again, so you detract away from that rider input and getting the most out of the ski. I've always loved, specifically why I love old two-strokes, is two different riders can get completely two different characteristics out of a ski. So the way I ride a Seadoo XP versus the way someone else rides a Seadoo XP, it comes down to how near the edge you want to go, near the envelope of what that ski can do. When jet skis become more compliant, it then takes some of that skill level away. So if it's inherently easier to just wheelie a Spark and hold that wheelie, is that a good thing? I don't know. It makes it more mass market again, but it potentially takes away some of that luster from like your old gen fans that are still looking for skill level in their riding. Put in the comments what you guys think. What should a jet ski be? Should a jet ski be, and I use the word jet ski, which everyone hates, sorry. What should a Seadoo or PWC should be? For me, it should be a balance between rider skill level and being good at what it should do. Undoubtedly, you want the performance to inherently be there for you to extract. I'm waffling slightly now, guys. The last thing that I want to touch on, and it's quite a big thing, and I thought about it quite a lot in the last couple of days, is when you think of the refined version or Gen 2 Spark with its more curvaceous lines, it takes me back, well, it doesn't take me back because I was a baby, but it takes me back to what was probably happening in the mid-90s. When that new XP mid-90s design came out with the nice curvaceous lines on the hood with the integrated mirrors, it was quite soft and it had quite a lot of flowing lines, which broke away from the more boxy, albeit primitive, and by no means trying to compare an original SP and original Gen XP to a Seadoo Spark angular lines, but it was way more angular and cut and shut than when we saw the actual X4 XP. So if I'm being fair and being reasonable, what Seadoo have done here is basically what they were doing in the 90s, where they took that original design and they tried to iron out some of the rough edges to kick on. And if you think about how long then that X4 lasted, it eventually turned into the SPX, as we know, from the XP, when the XP went to the hyperbolic V with the spring seat and that design completely changed. But what I'm trying to say is that is a much softer design. So in the last couple of days, I've kind of been looking at it thinking, Joe, you're being completely unreasonable, because what they've done is they've taken a design and they've refined it. And I'm using the word refinement now as opposed to saying softer, because refinement is, technically speaking, you know, if you think of the way they actually would automotively clay this design in the actual really, really early design stages, is they would be, you know, they would be taking the gradient off of those edges and smoothing things out and creating those nice flowing lines. So you have to give them credit as to what they're trying to do. It doesn't change the fact that the Gen 1 Spark is still a ski that will hold a period in time, which from a product styling point of view, which is amazing. As I've said in the first video, I think they knocked it out of the park. It just means that you have to try and embrace the new look, because I still believe we are going to get a faster Spark. It might not be for a year or 2 years, but if you think about the way the RXP has had that same 1630 engine, and now they've just seen 25 horsepower overnight been added, is going to happen with the Spark. Is an inevitability. The Spark will be here for another 10 years, 1,000,000%, specifically now with that design. So it's inevitable they're going to have to increase the performance at some stage. I don't ever think it's going to be huge performance jumps. Maybe it will be the 5 miles an hour.
year on year, potentially, like we see at 2 years now with this current design, then we see 5 miles an hour, or maybe we're even gonna see that 5 miles an hour now. Still don't believe that. Please put in the comments where that's came from. That to me again feels like dealer talk, trying to sell crafts. Guys, I hope you found this video helpful. Hopefully it's not been too much waffle, but I've done a lot of thinking around this ski in the last couple of days. I've been trying to benchmark it against my beloved old 2-strokes and seeing if there's any similarities in what they've done here as to what they did in the XPs back in the day. And I think there is, in all honesty, with the product styling side of things. I think they've missed a trick with the engine. If you think about the 717 and 95, as I've said before, and then you saw the 787 literally at the end of that year, I think the pacing needs to be picked up with Seadoo. I don't think it's fair or reasonable to wait 2 or 3 years. I think we will be waiting that amount of time, but I still don't think that they should. I don't think that they should rest on this design and just think that's enough now to keep people content. And I also still think 2-stroke fans would likely have a 2-stroke sat in their garage and have a new Spark sat in their garage if the Spark had an engine performance level comparable to that of the old 2-stroke. So that there, Seadoo, is basically me saying, if you made a faster Spark, I would buy one, I'd put it up against the Spark, I'd put it up against the old skis, and I'd be honest in the appraisal if the performance was comparable, which I don't think it will be at this point, because at 90 horsepower still, you've got a 95 XP that can still do 50 miles an hour with a 717 in it, which is just madness. Guys, I've rambled enough. Hopefully this video is helpful. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, let's keep the classics alive.